Well, good evening and welcome to this latest episode in our series of webinars. We host today's event under the banner of the Centre for Intelligent Design in the UK, and we're really pleased that you've joined us for this session. If this is your first time with us, it's been our objective over these past several months to present a sequence of topics which provide an understanding of aspects of design in nature. And we've been particularly keen to share evidence that calls the default understanding about the origin and complexity of living systems and their many characteristics into question. Asking these questions and considering such evidence is not only the healthy pursuit of truth, it's the way that scientific understanding has developed and grown over the last several hundred years. Our webinar series started early in the current pandemic with a series on virology. And since then, we've explored all manner of fascinating topics with thought leaders such as Steve Meyer, Mike Behe, Jim Tour, Doug Axe, Mike Denton, Gunter Beckley, Paul Nelson, and our own David Williams, and indeed others. And you can easily access all of these previous sessions. They're all recorded and available either through our website, C4ID, or through our YouTube channel. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you do. And we'll make sure, therefore, that you'll be informed of future events. Now, today, I'm really delighted to introduce our guest, Dr. Michael Egnor. Mike is a pediatric neurosurgeon, so I think this is the first time I've had the special pleasure of introducing a surgical colleague. He graduated in medicine from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and he's been widely recognized for his contributions to neurosurgery. Like many colleagues who are sympathetic to the design hypothesis, his Wikipedia entry is, as is usually the case, less than fulsome in its praise of his achievements. He's been associated with the Discovery Institute, where he's a senior fellow and is in international demand as a lecturer and broadcaster. And he's a regular contributor to the website mindmatters.ai, where he's contributed numerous articles. I've been following Mike's output for some years and was interested to hear his recent exchange with the atheist Matt Dillahunty, a rather feisty conversation, but as well as his scientific expertise, something of his philosophical awareness came through loud and clear. Now, after Mike gives his presentation on dualism and neuroscience, I'm going to ask my friend David Williams to moderate the Q&A session. So please make use of the chat facility on YouTube to post your questions and comments as we go along, and David will process these and feed them to Mike in the Q&A session. Mike, it's a delight to welcome you to the UK, albeit virtually on this occasion. Can I now invite you to go ahead and tell us about the evidence for dualism in neuroscience? Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's a real privilege to join my friends here at the Center for Intelligent Design, and I am delighted and honored to be asked to speak today. Roger Scruton, a philosopher who I like very much, described neuroscience years ago as a vast collection of answers with no memory of the questions. And I think it's a wonderful and very accurate description of the state of modern neuroscience. There's a tremendous amount of evidence available about the workings of the brain. But surprisingly little has been done in terms of making sense of that evidence in the sense of a philosophical or metaphysical understanding of the relationship between the mind and the brain. So in this talk, I want to ask, how does the mind relate to the brain? How is it that an organ that's comprised of matter can give rise to perceptions, to free will, to reason, to abstract thought? The mind-brain problem is perhaps the most intractable problem in modern science. I have found over the years in my reading and my study that actually ancient philosophers had a much more clear, much more simple, and I think a much more accurate understanding of the relationship between the mind and the brain than us moderns do, and I'll try to make that clear as time goes on. The original attempts to understand the relationship between the mind and the body were those of the Greek atomists, Democritus, Epicurus, and they believed that reality was made of atoms and the void. and that the mind was simply comprised of material particles, tiny material particles, and their interactions. The transition from that materialist view was really begun by Plato and followed up by Aristotle and a number of other great Greek philosophers. And then the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages followed on Plato and Aristotle, and we will get to that shortly. But after materialism and after this scholastic efforts to understand the mind and the body, René Descartes really changed the philosophical perspective when he proposed substance dualism. Descartes proposed that that our bodies were entirely material, they were essentially machines, and he called the material world res extensa, or extended substance. He described our minds as a separate substance, which he called res cogitans, or thinking substance. And he believed that more or less that human beings were ghosts in machines. As our bodies were machines, and our mind or our soul was a ghost of sorts that inhabited our bodies. There are three problems with the Cartesian view of the mind and the brain. The first problem is that I believe it's quite inadequate metaphysics. It views the body as a machine, and while we can use a machine analogy for many aspects of the body itself is not a machine, nor is nature as a whole a machine, in the sense that it's not an artifact of components that have no natural tendency to work together. They're just cobbled together as one might build a machine out of parts. There's a profound difference between the way machines work and the way bodies work. The other problem, the second problem with the Cartesian substance dualism problem, is the problem of interaction. That is, it wasn't clear, and still isn't clear entirely, how this immaterial res cogitans could interact with a res extensa. How could a ghost run a machine? And Descartes felt that the point of interaction was the pineal gland, which is a small gland in the middle of the brain. Clearly, it's not a particularly scientific viewpoint. The third problem, and I think in some ways the most serious problem with Cartesian dualism, is that by separating matter and mind as two separate substances, Descartes set up a situation where a couple of centuries later, the immaterial ghost aspect of man could simply be discarded. And modern materialists, in many ways, are really Cartesians who've just given up the ghost. They've given up the res cogitans. They just believe that everything that exists in nature is just matter extended in space. And they try to understand the mind on the basis of matter extended in space. Of course, if you believe nature is purely matter extended in space, then you've gotten rid of the res cogitans anyway, and you can't expect to understand the mind. So modern materialism is a kind of truncated Cartesianism. And in the 20th century, there were four major ways of trying to understand the mind from a materialist perspective. The first way was behaviorism. And behaviorism was a theory that the only thing that mattered scientifically was the input and the output to an organism, that the mind itself either didn't exist, or if it did exist, it was irrelevant to the science. Behaviorism had quite a run in the early 20th century. It was ultimately buried, ironically, by Noam Chomsky, who's a famous linguist, in the 1950s. But the main problem with the behaviorism, obviously, is that it was an attempt to understand the mind while denying the relevance of the mind to science. So behaviorism nowadays is essentially dead. Following behaviorism, identity theory was the most prevalent materialistic way of understanding the mind. Identity theory was the viewpoint that matter was identical to mental states, that a particular state of the brain was the same thing as a particular state of the mind, just understood under a different aspect. The problem with identity theory was pointed out years before by Leibniz, who said that if you are asserting that one thing is identical to another thing, they must actually be identical. That is, that there can be no differences between them. If there are differences between them, they're not identical. And of course, mental states share absolutely nothing in common ontologically with brain states. So they're not identical. They don't share anything in common. So identity theory has faded away. There's been some recent efforts to bring it back, but it doesn't have much viability anymore. Probably the most vibrant materialist way to try to understand the mind in the late 20th century was functionalism. And functionalism, although it has a number of different iterations, was predominantly computer functionalism. That is, that it was the view that the brain was the hardware and the mind was the software. And that thinking was a kind of computational state, a kind of algorithm. And the problem with functionalism, and this gets into the question as to whether machines are capable of being conscious, is that an algorithmic process is the antithesis of thinking. It's not simply the case that a machine cannot think. It's the case that what a machine does is the opposite of what thinking is. Thinking always implies meaning. That is, every thought has a meaning. It's directed at something. That property of direction is called intentionality. It is impossible to think of something without having something that's the object of the thought. The characteristic of computation, of using algorithms, is that they don't have any meaning. That's why they're useful. A good example of that is a word processor. If you're typing an essay, arguing for one side of an argument in the essay, you can use exactly the same word processor to argue for the other side of the argument in the essay. That is, the word processor, the algorithm, doesn't care about the meaning of the essay you're typing. And in fact, that's what makes the word processor so useful. If you had to use a different word processor for every opinion you held, word processors would become quite cumbersome. So meaning is inherent to thinking, and the absence of meaning is inherent to computation. So computation can't be thinking. So computer functionalism as a theory of mind is waning now. One of the most prevalent, I think probably the most prevalent view nowadays, is eliminative materialism. Eliminative materialism is championed by mainly by two philosophers, Paul and Patricia Churchland, who are materialist philosophers, who believe that the mind doesn't exist, that actually the only thing that exists are physical states of the brain, and that we have a misunderstanding, that we've invoked mental states when there really is no such thing as mental states. They're really all just physical states, and we shouldn't even speak of mental states anymore. The problem, of course, with eliminative materialism is that what the Churchlands are arguing is that there is no such thing as a belief. There's no such thing as an opinion. Beliefs and opinions are just brain states. But it's hard to argue that your opinion is that there are no opinions. That is, that they're making propositions that there is that the only thing that the proposition is matter, and of course matter is not the substrate of a proposition. So it's kind of gibberish and kind of nonsense, and I don't think it's going to ultimately go anywhere, but it actually is fairly popular among materialists nowadays. The viewpoint that that Cartesian dualism and modern materialism replaced was that of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And that viewpoint is called hylomorphism, which is matter and form in Greek. And it's based on Aristotle's and St. Thomas's metaphysics and on their psychology, on their understanding of nature. Aristotle asked a profound and very important question. He asked, what can we know about the things that exist in nature? And his answer was that we can know two things. We can know the intelligible aspects of something. If, for example, if I'm looking at a tree in my yard, I can know the height of the tree, the color of the tree, the physiology of the tree, all those things, the botany of the tree. But we also can know that it's that individual tree that I'm knowing and not, say, the other tree in my yard. So Aristotle said that everything in nature has a principle of intelligibility and a principle of individuation. And the principle of intelligibility he called form, and the principle of individuation he called matter. And he said everything that exists in the natural world is a composite of form and matter. Living things have forms, and the form is their soul. The matter is their body. He defined the soul in a way that I think is very important to recognize, because the way we tend to think of souls as moderns is as some sort of ghosty or wispy thing that fills the body and is kind of translucent, kind of like Casper the Ghost. And that's not at all what Aristotle meant by soul. What Aristotle meant by soul is that the soul is the activity of a body that makes it alive. A very good way of thinking of the soul is if you think of a person who dies suddenly, everything that was true of that person the moment before he died, subtracted from that, everything that is true of the person's body the moment after he died is the soul. The soul is what makes a dead body a living body. So a soul is basically a set of activities, of powers. And Aristotle pointed out that in the natural world, there seem to be three general categories of souls. There are vegetative souls, souls that plants have. And vegetative souls have the capacity for nutrition, for growth, for reproduction, for basic metabolism. But they don't have a capacity, as far as we know, for thought, for sensation, things like that. Aristotle pointed out that animals have more advanced souls. Animals have all the powers of vegetative souls. They can grow, they can eat, they can reproduce, but they can also have sensations, perceptions, imagination, memory, emotions. They can move. There are a whole bunch of different powers that animals have that plants lack, and you call that a sensitive soul. Human beings have souls that have all of the powers of plants and animals. We can grow, reproduce, take nourishment. We can also have perceptions, we can move, we can remember, we can have emotions, but we also have intellect and will. And Aristotle's definition of intellect and will are very important because they differ profoundly from the corresponding powers of animals. Intellect is the ability of human beings to think abstractly. And by abstractly, Aristotle meant that human beings can think of concepts without anything concrete in the concept. That is, I can think of justice, for example, without thinking of any particular courtroom or any particular situation involving justice. I can think of it as an abstract concept. I can think of numbers, like, for example, the square root of -1, which is a number that doesn't exist in nature in any way. But I can think of it, and if I'm a mathematician, I can use it in very important ways, in abstract ways. So Aristotle felt, and I think he's right, that only human beings have the capacity to think in abstract terms without any concrete substrate. Aristotle's concept of will was also important. The will is the appetite that follows on the intellect. That is, we understand things with our intellect, and then we rationally decide that we want it or don't want it by our will. We may, for example, think about having a meal, and we think about the nutritional content of the meal. And if it seems good for us and healthy for us, we then decide to go ahead and eat that meal. And the decision to go ahead and eat that meal is our will. And will differs from sensitive passions that we also have, which are irrational. We may just be hungry and want to eat the first thing we see. We may be angry, we may be happy or sad. Those are all passions that don't directly involve the will. The will is always rational. So Aristotle felt that human beings had these powers of intellect and will that was something that animals did not have. And he pointed out that powers of intellect and will are inherently immaterial. That is, that while the powers of plants and animals, of growth, reproduction, nutrition, perception, locomotion, all of those things, were clearly related to the matter of the body, that in order to perceive things with your eyes, you have to have eyes. To hear things, you have to have ears. To grow, you need to have a body. To take nutrition, you need to have a stomach. But Aristotle said that the abstract capacity for reason in the intellect and for free will in the will didn't come from the body. That was an immaterial power of the human soul. Now, that doesn't mean that under normal circumstances that the intellect and the will don't depend on the body in some ways. That is, normal activity of the intellect and will is the body is necessary for it. If you're hit on the head with a sledgehammer, your intellect and will are going to be altered. But the body is not sufficient for the intellect and will. There's an immaterial power that we have that doesn't come from the body. So in this sense, man is qualitatively different from animals. And because man has intellect and will, the capacity for abstract thought and free will. And one way of expressing it that I think is quite compelling but quite true is that our closest relative in biology is probably the ape. And apes are biologically very similar to human beings in many, many ways. And in terms of the vegetative and sensitive aspects of their souls are almost identical to us. But they differ from us in that they don't have intellect and will. They don't have these immaterial powers of mind. And you might say that man is more different from an ape than an ape is from a virus. Because an ape and a virus both have only material powers that constitute the soul that makes them alive. Man has an immaterial aspect of his soul that is shared by nothing else in the natural world. So these are fascinating philosophical reflections and represent a couple millennia of philosophical reflection. But one can reasonably ask the question, can neuroscience tell us anything about these issues? That is, can neuroscience adjudicate metaphysical questions? And I would answer emphatically that yes, it can. In fact, it must be able to do it. The reason is that metaphysics is the study of existence as existence, the study of being qua being, the old way of saying it. And natural science, as the scholastic philosophers defined it, I think their definition is the best definition that's ever been given. Natural science is the systematic study of nature, of natural effects according to their causes. So if scientists study the effects of things in nature, and they study specifically the causes of those effects. So these are all things that exist, so that natural science studies what exists in nature, and metaphysics is a science of existence itself. So there is overlap, and science informs metaphysics. And I would propose that science without metaphysics is blind, and metaphysics without science is blind as well. They need to talk to one another. So you can ask the question, what metaphysical questions about the mind-brain relationship or the mind-body relationship can you ask that can be addressed by science? And I think there are three fairly obvious questions, metaphysical questions that can be asked that neuroscience actually has spoken to very, very clearly over the past century. The first question is the human mind metaphysically simple? And metaphysical simplicity just means that the question is, can the human mind be divided into parts? Can you take the human mind and, for example, out of one mind make two minds or three minds or 10 minds? I would point out that all material things can be divided into parts. A loaf of bread can be sliced into as many slices as you want. Can that be done with a mind? Can the mind be sliced? If it can be, it would seem that it's likely to be something material. If it can't be, then it is metaphysically simple and would not have that property of a material thing. The second question you can ask is the human mind immaterial in some aspect? As Aristotle and St. Thomas had proposed, the intellect and will are immaterial powers of the mind. Are they really immaterial? Does the human mind have any powers that don't come from the brain itself? And the third question you can ask is, do we have free will? It's very popular nowadays among materialists and among many scientists, most of whom are materialists of one sort or another, to propose that free will is an illusion, that we're determined by the physical states of our brains and our bodies. Neuroscience can at least begin to get at the question of, are we really free or are we really determined? So those three questions, as I said, can be addressed by neuroscience, and they have been addressed. Let's begin with the question, is the mind metaphysically simple? The best research on that question was done by Roger Sperry, who was a neurophysiologist in the mid-20th century, worked in California, and who won the Nobel Prize for his research. Sperry was very interested in people who had undergone split brain surgery. Split brain surgery is a kind of neurosurgery that has been done since the early 20th century to treat intractable epilepsy. There are patients who have severe epilepsy who can have as many as 30 or 40 seizures a day. And the seizures start in one small area of their brain and then propagate across to the other hemisphere and become generalized in that way. And it was realized in the 1930s and 40s, at least in animals, that these seizures could be stopped by cutting the fiber connection called the corpus callosum, which is a huge bunch of fibers that run between the hemispheres of the brain. If you cut that fiber connection, the seizures are much milder and don't tend to generalize. So beginning in the 1950s, these operations were done on people, and they work quite well, and we still do them. They're still fairly common operations. I've done them myself, and they're very effective at treating seizures. One remarkable thing about these patients that I noticed, and that has been noticed by many others, is that after cutting the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain, these people are still perfectly normal people. There's no splitting of consciousness that's obvious. They're quite unitary. They don't feel any different. And they're really just fine, which is kind of surprising given that a large connection between the hemispheres of their brain has been severed. Sperry studied these people in some detail, and he found that there were some differences that he could identify. But all of the differences, they were really perceptual disabilities, or differences of perception, not differences of higher levels of mental function. And I won't go into great detail into these perceptual differences, but as an example, in most people, the left hemisphere of the brain is the hemisphere that is responsible for speech. And if you present a word to the right hemisphere in the visual field that's seen by the right hemisphere, a person who's had their brain disconnected can't say the word, but they know what the word is, and they can pick, for example, if the word is apple, they can't say the word apple, but they can pick an apple out of a container to let the examiner know that they saw the apple. So for this work, Sperry won the Nobel Prize. It was brilliant work, but these were very subtle findings. They were so subtle that finding them actually was Nobel Prize level research. Several researchers have worked on these patients since Sperry's time, Justine Sargent, McGill, and Yar Pinto, who works in Europe. And they found things that are fascinating that are very consistent with what I've seen as a practicing neurosurgeon. What they found is that patients who have split brain surgery have split perception, but unified consciousness is the term that Pinto uses. What they mean is that only a part of their mind is split. There's many aspects of their mind that are completely unified even after splitting the brain in half. And the example, I think the most striking example of this was research done by Justine Sargent in the 1980s. And she took people, and I won't go into the neuroanatomy too deeply, but basically in patients who've had split brain surgery, the left visual field and the left hand are linked, and the right visual field and right hand are linked, so that you cannot, if you've had split brain surgery, indicate what you're seeing in your right visual field with your left hand. You only indicate it with your right hand. So what Sargent did was she presented consonants and vowels in the right and left visual field randomly to people who had had split brain surgery, and she gave them buttons with their right and left hand. And she asked them to alternately push a button when they saw a vowel in any of their visual fields, either right or left. And what she found was that When people with split brain surgery would see a vowel, say, in their left hemisphere, they could still use their right hand to indicate that they saw the vowel, although the nerves controlling the right hand had no connection to the part of their brain that was seeing the vowel. That is, that their hands could operate independently of the part of the brain that was actually perceiving what the hand was indicating the person had seen. So what she concluded was that there was a part of the mind of these patients that didn't depend upon the physical connection between the hemispheres. As Pinto had said, there was a unity to their consciousness, even though there was a split in their perception. And that conscious unity has been my experience as well. The same phenomenon has been seen rather extensively in patients who have an operation called functional hemispherectomy. Functional hemispherectomy is kind of multiple split brain surgery, where we go in and we cut the brain in pieces, but leave the pieces in and function. The reason, again, is to stop seizures that propagate. And by cutting it into smaller pieces, the seizures can't travel across from one part to the other, and it calms the seizures down. And but the patients are still normal people. They're not cut into 5 pieces. So their minds are still unitary. So the question, is the mind metaphysically simple, can be answered at least in part by split brain surgery research. And the answer is that some aspects of the mind do seem to be metaphysically simple. They cannot be surgically split, particularly higher level consciousness, and to use Aristotelian and Thomistic terms, particularly the intellect and the will. The second question that we can ask is, are there aspects of the mind that are immaterial? That question was addressed in some depth by Wilder Penfield. Penfield is a very important figure in neurosurgery. He was a neurosurgeon who worked in the mid-20th century in Montreal, at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And he really is the pioneer of seizure surgery. And to do seizure surgery, he would do brain surgery on patients who were completely awake during the surgery. They were given local anesthesia, so they felt no pain, and the brain itself doesn't feel pain. And Penfield had to have them awake. And by the way, we do this surgery nowadays rather routinely. Penfield had to have them awake because he needed to stimulate their brains and test where the seizures were coming from, and test what areas of the brain were critical to their neurological functioning, so he could tell what he could safely remove to stop the seizures. And he operated on well over 1,100 patients with open brain surgery and with awake brain surgery. And he found some interesting things. He found that there were 4 different kinds of things he could stimulate by stimulating the surface of the brain. And he was stimulating deep areas as well. He could stimulate movement. He could make them move a limb. He could stimulate a perception or a sensation to make them see flashes of light. He could stimulate a memory. He could stimulate, for example, the temporal lobe, and they would remember their grandmother's face. And he could stimulate emotions. He could stimulate a part of the brain and make them feel a powerful emotion, happiness or fear or sadness. But he noted that he could never stimulate any kind of abstract thought. He could never stimulate the intellect. He could never stimulate mathematics. He could never stimulate an area of the brain that would make people add or subtract numbers, or think about philosophy, or think about logic. He said that was kind of odd, that there was a whole class of mental states that he could never simulate. And yet these mental states supposedly all came from the brain too. And he said, well, they don't seem to come from the brain because I can't evoke them, no matter what I do. And then he asked what I thought was a profound question. I think one of the most fascinating questions in neuroscience, that as far as I know, he's the only person who ever asked it. And he said, why are there no intellectual seizures? And when you look at the typology of seizures, and of course seizures have been studied in great detail in neurology and neurosurgery, there are innumerable different kinds of seizures. Generalized seizures where you go unconscious and shake all over. There are focal seizures where you have a movement of a single digit or a single limb or a single muscle. There are sensory seizures where you have repeated perceptions or sensations. There are emotional seizures where you have these overwhelming emotional states. There are seizures that evoke a sense of deja vu and memory. There are seizures that are complex, that can make people walk around and do things, like open and close doors and do all kinds of complex activities. But Penfield said there are no seizures that make you do calculus. There are no seizures that make you do any kind of mathematics or logic or philosophy. People never recite Shakespeare when they have a seizure. And he said, if seizures arise from the brain and can cause all sorts of different neurological manifestations, why is this one category of abstract thought excluded from seizures? And he said, perhaps it's because abstract thought doesn't come from the brain. I calculated, just a kind of a back of the envelope calculation, that in the past 200 years, the era of modern neuroscience, there have been 250 million seizures experienced by human beings. If you look at the incidence of seizures on an annual basis. So 250 million seizures, and unquestionably hundreds of thousands of reports in the scientific literature of seizures. And to my knowledge, as to Penfield's knowledge, there was never a single report of a seizure that had intellectual content. So Penfield concluded from this that the higher functioning of the mind, what we will call intellect, he didn't use that word for it, but abstract thought, didn't come from the brain, that it was an immaterial power of the mind, and I think he was right about that. There have been other experiments or other studies in neurosurgery and neurology that support Penfield's inference that there is an immaterial aspect to the human mind. There are rare conjoined twins who are joined at the brain. So the two people who share a part of their brain. The most famous ones recently are little girls named Krista and Tatiana Hogan in Canada. And they've been studied somewhat. I wish they were studied more. It's a fascinating question. And these kids do share the ability to move a common limb. They can both move the same arm. They share some sensations and perceptions on their skin. They can share emotions. But as best I can tell from reading about them, they don't share intellectual states. That is, one child connected at the head can't study mathematics homework and have the other child pass the test. That is, intellectual functioning remains separate. And they certainly, even though they share major parts of their brains, are quite separate human beings. They're different personalities, different people. Another line of research, I think, that is very suggestive that there are immaterial aspects to human thought was some groundbreaking research done by a neuroscientist at Cambridge named Adrian Owen. And Dr. Owen studied patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is a condition in which a patient has suffered such massive brain damage, either from trauma or from hypoxia, that it is assumed that they are not able to have mental states at all. Basically, the lights aren't on. There's nobody there. They're just a biological shell. They're not brain dead in the sense of actual biological death of all of the brain tissue, but a lot of their brain is dead to the point where there's really no one home. There's no subjective state. And Owen questioned this, and he questioned it scientifically by putting patients who were in persistent vegetative state into a functional MRI machine. And a functional MRI machine images regional blood flow in the brain that correlates with activity of the brain and can correlate with thought. And he would ask them questions through a loudspeaker while they were in the functional MRI machine. He would say, think of what 1 + 1 is, or think of playing tennis, or think of walking across a room, think of these things. And he noticed that these people in persistent vegetative state had areas of their brain that lit up as if they were, in fact, thinking about what he asked them to think about. He then took normal volunteers and put them in the machines and asked them the same questions, and parts of their brains lit up. He then blinded the studies so that you couldn't tell who was the brain damaged patient and who wasn't, gave it to other radiologists and said, looking at these functional MRI images, tell me which patients are brain damaged and which aren't, and they couldn't tell. That is, the patterns of brain activation in the severely brain damaged patients were identical to the patterns of activation in the normal people. Being a very good scientist, Owen then asked a question that he had to ask to make a good science, and that is, how did he know that the brain activation was actually because of understanding and not simply, say, the sound of the loudspeaker that the people were listening to? So what he did is he took the words that he asked and he jumbled the words. Instead of asking, imagine that you're adding 1 plus 1, he would say plus 1 adding imagine you're, so that the words didn't make any sense. And in the normal volunteers, the brain activation disappeared, and it disappeared in the patients who had PBS as well. So what Owen showed was that people with massive damage to their brain matter are still capable, in many cases, it's not everyone, but probably at least 40% of patients studied this way, and other people have replicated his work. These patients are still capable of high levels of abstract thought, despite the fact that their brains are materially profoundly damaged, which again supports the inference that there is an immaterial aspect to human thought. There are a number of other aspects of mind, brain or mind physical interaction that would suggest an immaterial aspect, one of which I'll touch on briefly is quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, subatomic particles exist, in fact, all particles exist in superimposed states of potentiality, possible states. And they coalesce, they collapse into an actual state with the process of measurement. Some people call this collapse of the quantum waveform. The interpretation of this collapse was a great mystery to the scientists working in the early era of quantum mechanics. And Niels Bohr and a number of other scientists developed what came to be called the Copenhagen Interpretation, which is still one of the leading interpretations of this phenomenon. And the Copenhagen Interpretation is that reality exists in a superimposition of quantum states until it's measured by a mind, until there's interaction with the mind. And when the mind interacts with it, these states collapse into a single state. That certainly implies, if it's true, that there's an immaterial aspect to the mind, because of course there's no physical interaction between the mind and the quantum state. It's just the action of observation. So there certainly is an implication there. There's something going on with mental states that is not entirely physical, but that has the capacity to affect a physical state. Another aspect of the human mind and of neuroscience that suggests that the human mind is not entirely a material phenomenon is found in the differences between humans and animals. Animals, as we pointed out earlier, have what are called sensitive souls. They have souls that enable them to have perceptions, to have emotions, to have movement, to have feelings of hunger, things of that sort, but they don't have the capacity for intellectual reflection. And we experience this lack of capacity for intellectual reflection in many ways with our household pets. I have a cute little dog. She loves to have her treats. We give her little cookies to eat, but she never thinks about nutrition. She's a little on the chubby side. She eats too many cookies, but you can tell that the way she thinks about her food is purely on a perceptual and emotional basis. She likes her food. She sees it. She smells it. She wants to eat it. She doesn't think about calories. She never thinks in terms of nutrition. Animals are not capable of that level of abstract thought. And one important aspect of the manifestation of abstract thought that relates to the difference between humans and animals, of course, is language. And Noam Chomsky, who's certainly the greatest modern linguist, has pointed out that language is really unique to human beings, that animals don't have language. And it's true that many animals, such as great apes, have been taught what one would call sign language and appear to use a kind of language. But it's important to understand that what they're doing is not language. There are signs in the world, and signs are things in the world that point to other things. And there are two basic kinds of signs that are used by humans and animals. One kind is called a signal, and the other is called a designator. A signal is a sign that physically points to the object it's pointing to. So, for example, if someone asks me, how do you get to New York? And I point that way. That's a signal. I'm giving him a signal that he should go that way to get to New York. A designator is a sign that doesn't physically point, but conceptually points. For example, if someone asks me what that animal in my front yard is, and I say, it's a cat. The word cat doesn't in any way physically point to that animal. It doesn't sound like the animal sounds. It doesn't look like the animal. It doesn't have any directionality to it. That's a designator. Animals can use words. For example, my little dog responds to the word cookie by getting excited, but she uses it as a signal. The word points in a meaningful sense to the treat I'm going to give her. She doesn't understand the word cookie as a noun, as a word, as a designator. Only human beings use words as designators. So only human beings have language, and the capacity for language is abstract and conceptual, just as Aristotle and St. Thomas said. It's an immaterial power of the human mind. It's what makes human beings different from animals. Another line of reasoning that I find rather compelling to distinguish the human mind from the animal mind is that it has often been argued, particularly by materialists and by Darwinists, that human beings are very, very similar to apes biologically. That is, if you look at human DNA, and ape DNA, or human anatomy and ape anatomy, that there's a high level of similarity. I forget the percentage, I think it's 97 or 99% correspondence between human DNA and ape DNA. And the reasoning that many materialists have used based on this is that, well, then humans are basically just apes. We're just rather sophisticated apes. But I point out that the enormous biological similarity between humans and apes needs to be understood in light of the enormous mental differences between humans and apes. That is, we are having a webinar now as humans, and apes don't have webinars. Apes don't have civilizations. Apes don't have language. They don't have mathematics. They don't have philosophy. The mental difference between humans and apes is qualitative, not just quantitative, and it is vast. It's an unbridgeable gap between humans and apes. But our bodies, the material of our brains and bodies, is remarkably similar. So that would argue that what makes humans different from apes is not material aspects of our brains, but the immaterial aspects of our brains. As Aristotle and St. Thomas would say, our immaterial intellect and free will. So the extreme biological similarity between humans and other animals actually argues for the immateriality of the intellect and will in the human mind, because it's difficult to account for such a profound difference in the mind unless one attributes the mind to something that is not material. Another aspect of neuroscience that points to the immateriality of the mind, points very strongly, is near-death experiences. And near-death experiences are a bona fide focus of modern medical research. There are a number of scientists who've devoted themselves to it, including a colleague of mine named Sam Parnia, who used to be at Stony Brook. He's now at NYU, who has studied near-death experiences in great detail. And it is very clear, in my view, that near-death experiences, at least a subset of them, at least 20% of them, represent actual mental states that occur when there is no brain activity. These mental states, so they're often called veridical experiences, experiences that are true and can be confirmed, involve people who are in full cardiac arrest, in some cases who've actually had brain waves measured that are flat, that are absent, who have awareness of what's going on around them and have continuing mental states even in these extreme states of lack of brain activity. So while some near-death experiences may in fact have a physiological or materialist explanation, in my view, there's no question that a large number of near-death experiences are genuine. And that certainly indicates that there's an immaterial aspect to the human mind and to the human soul. So the question, is the mind metaphysically simple and is the human mind immaterial? These are metaphysical questions to which neuroscientific evidence can be applied. And in my view, the neuroscientific evidence argues strongly in the affirmative that the human mind, at least aspects of the human mind, intellect and will, are metaphysically simple, and that the intellect and will are immaterial powers of the mind. They're not derived directly from matter. The third question we can ask is, do we have free will? Is free will real? It is very popular with scientists nowadays, particularly materialist scientists, to argue that we really don't have free will, that free will is an illusion, that our choices are determined by the states of our brains, by our history, by our environment, and that we really don't have anything that can meaningfully be called freedom. The question of free will has been addressed in neuroscience, and the two most prominent researchers who have looked at it. The first is Wilder Penfield, the neurosurgeon we talked about earlier, who did the awake brain surgery research. And he also looked at the question of free will. And he asked it in kind of a fascinating, rather clever way. During the surgery, when he would have these patients awake and he'd be stimulating the surface of their brain, he would occasionally stimulate their motor area of the brain. That would make them move, make them raise their hand or move their arm. The brain itself has no sensation. So the patient would not know that he wouldn't feel the stimulation in his brain. He would only feel the movement. And so Penfield asked the people under the surgical drapes, he said, you're going to move your arm on occasion. I want you to decide to move it. And of course, there will be times when I will make it move by stimulating your brain. And I want you to tell me if you can tell the difference. That is, when your arm moves, tell me, did you move it or did I move it? So he would do it during the operation hundreds of times. And he said in over 1,100 patients with hundreds of stimulations in each patient, they always got it right. They always knew whether the movement of their arm was caused by Penfield or whether they moved it themselves. That is, they had free will. Penfield could never override their free will. He could never, by stimulating their brain, make them will something. They're always aware their will was not stimulatable. It was independent of what Penfield was doing, and they could always tell the difference. So he was convinced that free will was a real thing, and that he showed it in his surgical work. Benjamin Libet was a neurophysiologist in the middle of the 20th century who, unlike Roger Sperry, didn't win the Nobel Prize, but I think he should have. Libet was a brilliant researcher, and he did a great deal of research in many aspects of cognitive neuroscience. And his personal fascination was with time. Libet was intrigued with what is going on inside the brain when you have a thought. And he was interested in what's the timing. That is, if there's a spike in your brain activity and you're thinking of something, are they simultaneous? Or does the brain activity happen a little before the thought or a little after the thought? And he wrote a popular book called Mind Time, where he looked at a lot of these questions, and it's fascinating work. His most famous work was on looking at the question of free will. And what he did was this. He had experimental subjects sitting at a desk, and he had electrodes on their skull to measure their brainwaves. And he had a clock in front of them with a sweep hand. And you could determine a moment in time. The research subject could determine a moment in time down to a level of about 10 milliseconds by looking at the sweep hand going around. And they had a button that they were to push. And Libet said, just sit in that chair, and whenever you feel like pressing the button, press the button. just make a decision. You can sit there for 10 minutes and then decide, I think I'll press the button and press the button. He said, when you think of pressing the button, when you make that decision, note the time on the clock, and that will be recorded. And at the same time, he was recording their brainwaves and he was recording the button they pushed. And he found that very consistently, roughly 3/4 of a second before they pushed the button, there was a spike in their brainwaves that corresponded to pushing the button. Then, about a half second later, they would consciously be aware of the decision to push the button. And then maybe a 1/4 of a second later, they'd push the button. That is, the brainwave always came before any conscious awareness of a decision. And it made it seem as though they weren't really deciding themselves. Their brain was telling them to push the button. That is, that they weren't free to decide. The brainwave kind of came out of nowhere and made them push the button. But being a good scientist, Leibniz looked a little further into this. And what he did was he told them, go ahead and push the button the same way we were doing it. Only once in a while, veto your decision. That is, decide to push the button, but then decide not to. And let's look at what happens to the brainwaves when you decide not to. And what he found was that there was no brainwave associated with a veto. So there was a brainwave with what he called the temptation to push the button. That brainwave that was 3/4 of a second before the button. But the decision time, when you make your decision and then go to pushing the button, all of that was silent, whether you push the button or not. So he said that, in a way, he didn't prove that free will exists, but he proved that free won't exist. That is, he said that he proved that there are unconscious temptations of sorts that come from our brains that urge us to do things. But we have a conscious and immaterial, not from the brain, choice as to whether we do it or not. Our veto is silent in the brain. And presumably, our assent is silent also in the brain. So Leibniz pointed out that this understanding of free will that he found in his own research was very much like the traditional Christian understanding of original sin. He said, in a sense, that there are motives, temptations in us that are unconscious, that are driving us. And we can't stop the unconscious motives, but we can choose freely whether or not to comply with these motives. So he was a very strong advocate of free will, even though his research has been used, I think, quite disingenuously by materialists to support determinism and lack of free will. Leibniz actually clearly showed by his research that, to the extent his research could verify it, that free will is real. So I believe that neuroscience can address the question, is the mind metaphysically simple? Is the intellect and will immaterial? And is free will real? And these metaphysical questions, I think, can be answered in the affirmative by modern neuroscience. Looking back at the metaphysical frameworks that one could use to answer these questions, the three frameworks we've discussed are, first of all, materialism, which has a lot of variations, but materialism is a general framework. Cartesian dualism, or Thomistic dualism. And materialism clearly can't explain metaphysical simplicity of the mind. It can't explain immateriality of the intellect and will, and it really can't explain, in my view, free will either. Cartesian dualism could explain it, but it can't explain, I don't believe, in any kind of natural or easy way, how it is that some things, like perception, can be split by splitting the brain. But other things, like abstract thought, can't be split. Thomistic dualism, based on Aristotle's psychology, beautifully explains it. In fact, modern neuroscience, I see, is just the scientific demonstration of how right Aristotle and St. Thomas were in their understanding of the mind. So then we can ask a question that Wilder Penfield, the neurosurgeon who did the awake brain surgery question, asked. And a question that I think is absolutely fascinating and gets into somewhat even deeper metaphysical and even theological questions. And one thing that Penfield noted in his book public. He wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind, where he reflected on his research at some length. He said that one thing that he couldn't stimulate on the brain a whole bunch of different things that are abstract thought, but he also said that there was the very sense of self, the very sense that I am, the subjective sense, he couldn't stimulate. That seemed to be something that was entirely beyond the reach of his instruments. And he wondered, what is this sense of I am? It didn't seem to be in the brain. And what is it? And of course, many people have asked that question. I thought Penfield asked it in a particularly interesting way in the scientific realm. And related to that was a point made by John Searle. Searle is a philosopher from California, who asked a question, not asked a question, but made a point. He's a philosopher of mind. He is a materialist and an atheist. But he said that whatever philosophy of the mind turns out to be the right one, it will have to be a philosophy that puts the mind as a natural thing. That is, it has to fit into nature. You can't just call in something from completely outside of science and outside of rationality and make that the explanation of the mind. He says essentially the mind has to be something that fits into the natural world. And I think he's right about that. I think that any theory of mind that's worth believing and worth pursuing has to have a consilience with the rest of the natural world. So you can ask this question, how can we understand the mind in light of the natural world? And with particular reference to Wilder Penfield's question of where's this I am in there? That is that all these powers of the mind that we study, perception, sensation, locomotion, memory, intellect, will, who is it that has these? We're talking about the powers, we're not talking about the agent that has them. And what is the agent? And how do we understand the agent that is ourselves? And the Thomistic way of looking at nature is that there are four causes of things in nature. If we are to understand how nature works, we have to understand these four causes. And the four causes are material causes, formal causes, efficient causes, and final causes. Material causes are basically just the stuff that things in nature are made of. Formal causes are the intelligible patterns of things, the shape, the sort of the intelligible science behind them. Efficient causes are the movers, the agents that make things happen, like the efficient cause of a statue is the sculptor who sculpts the statue. And final causes are the purposes or the directedness of the process in nature. For example, the final cause of an acorn growing into an oak tree is the oak tree. So the teleology, the final cause, teleology is just another word for final cause of the acorn is the oak tree. This particular way of looking at nature, Aristotle's way of looking at nature, which has been called hylomorphism, sees nature as full of purposes. And Aristotle said, and St. Thomas agreed, that final causes, teleology, is the most important cause. It's as Aristotle said, the cause of causes. It pulls the other causes along, and that none of the other causes make any sense unless you assume that there's teleology and purpose in nature. If nature has no purposes, then everything is chaos. A fascinating related observation was made by Franz Brentano, who was a philosopher in the 19th century, who tried to ask the question, is there one characteristic of mental states that is unique to mental states and is never a characteristic of a physical state? And he said, yes, there is. And that characteristic is intentionality. And intentionality is the capacity of a thought, of a mental state, to be about something. And a physical thing is never intrinsically about anything. For example, this pencil is not, to make sure it's focused, this pencil is not about anything. Whereas my thought about the pencil is about something, it's about the pencil. So mental things always have a directedness to them. But if you notice, Aristotle and St. Thomas pointed out that the most important cause in nature, which is final cause or teleology, is also a kind of directedness. That is, we have in our minds, in fact, what characterizes our minds is what characterizes purposes in nature also. We have our purposes, and nature has its purposes. And I believe that neuroscience points us to immateriality of mind, to the presence of intentionality, of directedness in intellect and will and mental states. And you see the same kind of intentionality, directedness, and purpose in nature itself. And nature certainly manifests a kind of a great mind, a mind that stands outside of nature, that guides it. That really is St. Thomas's fifth way for demonstrating the existence of God. That God is the directedness and the purposes present in nature. And we have our own directedness and purposes in our own mind. And I think this in many ways fulfills Cyril's view that we have to place the human mind in the natural world. In a sense, the human mind, I believe, is an image of the mind that created the natural world. And we are created in the image of that mind. And I believe that neuroscience offers strong support for that viewpoint. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Let me get the spotlight working. Well, where do I start? Where do I start with that? Let me go back to something you said at the beginning. You said apes. When talking about intellect and will, you said that apes don't have intellect and will. Now, I know you've given some specific examples, for example, with language. But what would be your evidential basis for such a categorical statement that apes and other animals, any other animal, doesn't have intellect and will?
Sure. The most obvious statement is that I've never seen any evidence that they do. That is, that claims that they do, that they're capable of abstract thought, when you look carefully at the scientific studies, invariably show that the apes are using signals instead of designators. That is, that you can train animals to do incredible things. A very good example was a horse called Clever Hans. Have you ever heard the story of Clever Hans? Clever Hans was a horse in Germany back about 100 years ago who supposedly was capable of doing mathematics. And he had an owner who would take him around Germany as like a circus show. And made a lot of money off it. And he would ask Clever Hans, he would say, Clever Hans, what is 8 plus 2? And Clever Hans would, with his hoof, hit the ground 10 times. And he was quite accurate. He could do simple arithmetic and simple addition and subtraction. So Clever Hans was studied quite extensively by psychologists and scientists in Germany. And they found out what was happening. What they did was to show what was going on is that they took Clever Hans's owner, his trainer, and they put him behind a screen. And they asked Clever Hans, what's 8 plus 2? And Hans didn't do anything, had no idea. When Clever Hans could see the owner, he could do 8 plus 2. What was happening was that the horse was taking cues from the owner. He would tap his hoof, and when he reached the 10th tap, his owner would smile, make a facial expression, Hans would stop. He was trained to do that. The owner didn't do this on purpose. It was all subtle because horses were very good at sensing the will of their owner because they're ridden all the time. So a little muscle movement a horse pays attention to. So that's what happens with animals. Animals imitate intellect and will. But all they're doing is using, they're really just being trained using their perceptual capabilities. And their perceptual capabilities can be very powerful. And animals can be very clever, but it's always concrete. All animal thought is concrete. Ask an animal what the square root of 25 is. All right, he'll never tell you the answer. Never tell you. And in fact, if you think about it, an animal cannot think abstractly for the simple reason that they have no language. That is, all thoughts are about things. There's always an aboutness, an object. There can conceptually be two different kinds of objects of thought, something concrete, like an apple, or something abstract, like the square root of -1. But if it's abstract, you have to have a word for it, because it's not a physical thing. So you must have a word for it, or you can't think of it. How could you think of justice if you have no word for justice? So animals don't have words, they don't have language. So they're incapable, they don't even have the medium through which they could think abstract. So no animal has abstract thought.
Okay, I'll come back to language. I think we'll return to language. Can I ask you this? You talked about whether the human mind was immaterial, and you gave the example on divisibility, if I can call it that, about the person seeing a vowel after the mind split surgery or brain split surgery, seeing a vowel, left hand, right hand example, but they can't say apple. Mm-hmm. So just talk me through it again. They could sure. If right side could see a vowel, but they couldn't say it.
Yes. It's a very interesting question, and I had to go through it fairly quickly because it's kind of subtle research. It's beautiful work, and the surgeon did great work on this. What she did, what she found, and what Sperry had found, is that when the hemispheres are split, the left hemisphere in most people mediates speech. The right hemisphere commonly will mediate perceptions of three-dimensional space, but is not capable of speaking. And the arms are controlled, respectively, right arm by left hemisphere, left arm by right hemisphere. So that if the brain is split, as far as speech goes, and again, speech is a purely material thing. We're not talking about abstract thought now. If you see an apple and you want to say apple, if the apple is being shown to the visual area in the right hemisphere and that's not connected to your speech hemisphere, you see the apple, but you can't say it because you can't speak it. But you can pick it out of a basket and say, this is what I saw, but I can't say it. And Sperry showed a whole bunch of things like that. And
so just to answer that, this might be a silly question, but the left, so you're saying the left side is the speech side?
Yes.
Could they can pick the apple out of a barrel with either hand, left and right?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure actually. They could. I know that they could point to it. I don't know that he even tested the hand of this. But what surgeon did was tested the hand of this. She was very interested.
Because I was going to follow. I was going to follow that to ask.
Yes. So what surgeon did was used a somewhat different paradigm, but one that was very clever. The way the anatomy works is your right hand and visual field mediated by your right hemisphere are linked. Your left hand and visual field mediated by your left hemisphere are linked. And in you and I, who have intact corpus callosums, that information can go back and forth very easily. In patients who had a cut corpus callosum, that information cannot go back and forth very easily. So there's some degree of isolation of these visual fields. In everyday life, patients who've had that corpus callosotomy can look around and turn their heads in such a way that it doesn't bother them. They're not even aware of it. But if you force them to look forward, and they actually would put their heads in braces, and then they would make them look straight at something and just use visual fields, you can isolate the visual fields and isolate the hemispheres. What surgeon did was she would flash letters, consonants and vowels, thousands of times in visual fields, right, left, everywhere. And she would ask these people to push buttons when they saw anything, or when they saw a consonant, when they saw a vowel, whatever. So she kind of got them used to pushing buttons. Then what she did is she would flash letters randomly into one or both visual fields. And she would tell the person, when you see a vowel, push the button with your left hand. Any vowel, anywhere in your vision, use only your left hand. Then she would say after 100 trials of that, when you see a vowel now, push the button with your right hand. And what she tested was could the person push the button with a hand controlled by the hemisphere that was blind to the vowel? And it could. It didn't matter which hand. So when the vowel was presented to the left hemisphere, the right hand was just as good at pushing the button as the left hand was. And she timed them, because one of her hypotheses was that there was a workaround. That is, when you cut the corpus callosum, you don't cut everything. You still got a brainstem. And could the action potentials be traveling down into the brainstem and coming around, so the brain wasn't totally cut? And she found that there was no time for that. That is, that it took a certain number, it would have taken a certain number of milliseconds for the signals to get around. And the pushing the buttons showed no difference of that magnitude. So what she showed was that while the perceptual aspect was in some sense split, the awareness of a vowel transcended the perceptual aspect, and they were aware of the vowel in a metaphysically simple way that had nothing to do with the hemispheres.
Okay, well, it's fascinating stuff, and I'm mightily relieved that my question wasn't a silly question.
No, it was a great question. And I should point out, it took me about a month to really understand what she did, meaning that it's a very subtle question, but it's beautiful. Beautiful.
You said about seizures, that there's not been any intellectual seizures. Again, this maybe, and you've talked about language and perhaps music would fall into that category as well. But there have been cases where people have been reported to have had an accident or a brain injury, and then suddenly can speak a language that no one knew they could speak of. Are those just mythical stories, or is there an explanation for that?
Well, I suspect they're mythical. I mean, that's been reported in demonic possession, certainly. And I've not heard of that happening in epilepsy. And if one has to be very careful with epilepsy to distinguish the ictus itself from mental states associated with the ictus. That is that, for example, one can have a seizure that involves a sensory perception and also have an experience of fear. The fear isn't necessarily the seizure. The fear may be the non-epileptic response to the seizure. So the kind of thing that Penfield was talking about, that I'm talking about, is the seizure ictus itself. For example, with the intellectual thing, a person can have a seizure and then have an abstract intellectual thought about the seizure. But the seizure itself doesn't have intellectual content. They're the only kind of seizure, and I've actually discussed this or debated this with a neuroscientist from Canada, who pointed out there is a rare kind of seizure called a forced thinking seizure that he thought did have intellectual content. But when you look carefully at forced thinking seizures, it's a very rare kind of seizure. Basically, it's seizure as OCD, patients who get obsessions. They can't stop thinking of something. And there are a few people who have what appears to be OCD who are actually having seizures. However, when you look carefully at the ictus, at the nature of the seizure, it is invariably concrete, meaning they think of something like they'll think of the doorknob, or they'll think of the pencil in front of them, or they'll think of an emotion, but they'll never think of calculus. They'll never think abstractly. So even forced thinking seizures never have an abstract content. What Penfield meant, and what I mean by intellectual seizure, which never happens, is abstract intellectual content. And there are no calculus seizures, even though the brain supposedly is where calculus comes from. But no one, to my knowledge, has ever seized and done mathematics.
Let me move on swiftly. You mentioned the permanent vegetative state. One question that's come in is that the same thing as locked-in syndrome or locked-in state syndrome?
No. It's good to distinguish three things that can easily be confused. One is brain death. And brain death is biological death of the entire brain, beginning at the junction of the spinal cord and the medulla. So a person who's brain dead is dead, basically. The persistent vegetative state is a condition in which the damage to the brain is so severe that the person does not appear to be able to make any meaningful interaction with their environment. They can't speak. They appear to be just a set of reflexes. And the assumption has been that they have no internal mental states. I think that assumption is wrong. And the research by Adrian Owen and many others is showing that it's wrong. But for many decades, it was felt to be the reality. And Terry Schiavo was a famous was a patient who was starved to death in the United States, who was in persistent vegetative state about 20 years ago. And the assumption that she had no mental state was the basis for allowing her to be starved to death, because they felt that she wasn't there anyway, and she was just a shell. Locked-in state is a condition of paralysis. People with locked-in state have completely normal lives. What happens in locked-in state, usually it's a central pontine hemorrhage or infarct that interrupts the tracks of the brain going down to the spinal cord. So in locked-in state, generally the only voluntary movement the person is capable of doing is vertical movements of the eyes, but they are fully conscious. In fact, that's what makes them locked in. They're not comatose, and they can be mistaken for being comatose, but they're fully conscious.
Thank you. Just one question on the permanent vegetative state is this: are you saying that there is empirical evidence that a significant number of people in that state remain capable of high-level abstract thought?
Yes, categorically. The numbers when I last looked were about 40%. My recollection, there are 4 or 5 pretty good studies that have replicated Owen's work, and upwards of 100 patients who've been studied, and about 40% of them show very clear evidence of capacity for significant high-level thought. The people have had conversations. There's a famous case where a man in persistent vegetative state was asked about his past, about friends he had when he was a child, and he was able to communicate the identities of these people, and were checked and found to be true. Yes, there's no question. Many people in persistent vegetative state have high levels of awareness. But it's funny because nurses and families of patients in coma have been telling us that for years. Nurses will tell us when we walk into the room of a comatose patient, they very often will tell the doctor, don't say anything upsetting, because their heart rate will go up, and it'll make their blood pressure go up. Families learn to be very circumspect about saying things in the presence of comatose patients. I'm very careful. I never say anything in the presence of a comatose patient that I wouldn't say in the presence of a fully awake patient, because I think that many people in coma understand very, very clearly what's going on.
Thank you. But one more question, and we're going to move to the subject of free will. And I'm going to bring David Galloway in on the subject of free will. But the final question before we get to that last topic is this: you talked about biological similarities with humans and apes, but you talked about also the great differences. When one looks at the mind or the brain, and I appreciate that mind and brain are not do not mean the same thing to many people. How do you see the similarities and differences biologically between the stuff that's inside our head, brain, between us and apes?
It's a great question. We have larger frontal lobes, and we have a greater mass of cortex and more convoluted cortex. But besides that, there's not much difference. That is that, for example, we could easily use ape brains in neuroanatomy class for medical students. The basic structure of the brain is identical, with the exception, again, that our frontal lobes are larger and more complex. But the basic, the brainstem, the diencephalon, the basic ganglia, the basic structure of the lobes is really the same. In fact, let's face it, most neuroscience that is applied to our understanding of the human mind is from animals. The animal brain is, at least the higher animals, is very, very, very similar to the human brain. My daughter is a veterinary neurosurgeon, and we talk about neurosurgery a lot. It's quite interesting because it's a whole science of veterinary neurosurgery that's developed independently of human neurosurgery. And we can talk about a lot of the same stuff. We see the same stuff in human brains and animal brains.
Okay. Now, I could spend all night talking to you about free will, so I'm going to have to resist the temptation. So I will bring David Galloway in because I think I'm going to have to sit on my hands.
I would love to talk about it. I'd love to talk about it.
David,
because I have a lot to learn about it. There's a lot that I don't understand.
Thanks, David. Mike, thanks for that lecture. Really fascinating stuff, and the way that you put all that together logically was wonderful, really. But I want to just go back to this question of the readiness potential in Benjamin Leibotz's work.
Yes. Yes.
So clearly there's, to my mind, what has become a somewhat unsophisticated interpretation of what that electrical activity actually means. And of course, it's been labeled therefore as a readiness potential. If indeed free will is real, how would you explain that readiness potential? Is it some kind of epiphenomenon? Or what do you think the mechanism might be? Is it wrong to label it as a readiness potential? Could it be some other neurophysiological activity that actually is part and parcel of the whole process?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the readiness potential issue, and Leibniz was aware of this. The readiness potential, actually, he wasn't the one who discovered it. It had been discovered about 20 years before him in Germany. Although the people who discovered it didn't quite apply it the same way he did. And first of all, the readiness potential seemed to correspond to the side of the brain associated with the pushing the button. That, for example, if you push a button with your right hand, readiness potential would generally be in the premotor area of your left hemisphere. It has been verified using functional MRI imaging that there is activity in the brain that kind of correlates with decision making, even as much as 10 or 20 seconds before a decision is made. And there's been tremendous discussion as to what that means. First of all, obviously, when we talk about free will in a human sense, we're not talking about pushing buttons. We're talking about much more complex, intricate decisions. And what Leibniz used was a very artificial situation. So I think the best interpretation of Leibotz's work is that the idea of free will remains a completely viable idea, despite the readiness potential. The way I see the readiness potential, and I talked with Mark Solms, who's a neurophysiologist who's done some wonderful work, and I talked with him on a podcast about a month ago about this. I think that the brain itself, including the readiness potential, is what Freud called the unconscious. That is, I don't think that processes that go on in the brain are conscious to us in any meaningful way. I think our consciousness is something that's not material. And I think that basically the brain is the id. And I think that that's a nice way of putting it. So we are bombarded by our id, by our unconscious, with all sorts of biochemical phenomena. That we've got spikes going everywhere. I know I've got spikes going everywhere. And these unconscious things motivate us to do or not do things. But we retain a conscious, free choice to choose or not. The choices can be pushed. You know, the motivations can be very strong, and the motivations all too often overwhelm our ability to choose otherwise. But we do have the ability to choose otherwise.
It's just always seemed to me, you know, that the idea that free will is somehow disproved by this tiny little aspect of poorly understood neurophysiology is a rather weak interpretation of what's going on. So, but nevertheless, it comes out time and time and time again, and you're always hearing about it. Yeah.
And you know, and the funny thing is that it's a complete misrepresentation, actually, of Leibotz's work. That Leibniz believed in free will, and he showed that the veto was electrically silent. That's ignored by the people who use Leibotz's work. And of course, it's a very artificial situation. There are other reasons, of course, to believe that free will is real. An obvious reason is that determinism is not true. Yes. That is, that in physics, it's very well established that at least that there are no local hidden variables in physics, so that determinism as a metaphysical perspective of physics is just wrong. The other reason, besides that the neuroscience, I think, is perfectly consistent with free will. The other reason is that if free will is not real, then the opinion that there is no free will is itself not an opinion that's freely chosen. It's an opinion that's determined by a brain state, which is a set of chemicals. And because chemicals are not propositions and have no truth value, then even the assertion that free will isn't real is self-refuting. Because if free will isn't real, then you can't choose the truth. And basically, this is just a secretion of your brain. There's no reason to ascribe any truth value to it at all.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask my final question, because I'll resist the temptation. I'm going to exercise my free will to resist a long discussion on free will, but I'm going to give in to the temptation of one question. Is there any evidence of brain changes in someone who would be described as an addict or addiction when it comes to making a choice about the thing to which they are addicted?
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm certain that it's not a topic that I study personally, but there's a whole branch of neuroscience devoted to studying the brain changes that take place in the setting of addiction. So yes, there are profound changes that take place.
I suppose what I'm getting at is, would those changes in some way negate free will?
No. They make it more difficult to freely choose, but they don't negate it. What I think of as one of the best analogies to free will was Plato's analogy of the chariot. This was particularly clever. Plato saw the human soul as a chariot driver with two horses, and the horses, one horse was concupiscible passions, the other was irascible passions, meaning looking for comfort and pleasure or looking for anger. And the reins of the chariot were held by the driver of the chariot. The driver was the intellect, basically, this in Aristotelian terms. The reins are the will, and the horses are the unconscious passions. And you try to control the passions to get the chariot to go where you want it to go. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes the horses are too frisky, and no matter how hard you pull the reins, it pulls you. But that doesn't mean that you don't have the reins. The reins are the free will. And let's face it, we all know there are times when we're simply overwhelmed, when we do things that we don't want to. But that doesn't mean that we're not free. It just means that our passions overwhelmed our freedom in that moment.
Thank you, Michael. It's been absolutely fascinating. I could spend all night talking about these things, but I will hand you back to David Galloway now, and my thanks again for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
Good. Mike, let me just add my thanks. That was a very thought-provoking and logically engaging talk. Great input and good searching questions from the audience. So thanks everyone for that engagement. One contributor indicated that he plans to go back through the detail again, and I sense that you're not alone there. That's the beauty of having this recorded. So as we conclude this evening, and as the festive season approaches, let me wish everyone a very happy Christmas season, and let me also say that we're absolutely delighted to look forward with eager anticipation to our next conversation, which will feature John Lennox on January the 17th. So we'll be firing out the emails as usual with some detail about that. Some of you may know that John has just released an updated, expanded version of one of his previous books. It's called Cosmic Chemistry. So there's some homework for you if you want to prepare for January the 17th and engage with us on that occasion. But once again, my thanks to Mike Egnor. Really been wonderful to get to know you, Mike, and to hear that lecture, and we'll have that on our YouTube channel for any that might have missed it. So with that, we'll conclude today's activity. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. and we'll